So public criticism of the use of the injunction against labor unions caused Congress to pass the Clayton Act in 1914. This act stated that labor was not a commodity, that the existence and operation of labor organizations were not prohibited by antitrust, and that individual members of unions were not restrained from lawful activities. It further provided that neither the labor organization nor its members were considered illegal combinations or conspiracy in restraint of trade. The courts still continued to apply the Sherman Antitrust Act after passage of the Clayton Act by narrowly interpreting its provisions. The courts felt that secondary strikes, boycotts, and picketing were not covered by the Clayton Act because of the employer-employee language and because legitimate objects of labor would not include strikes and activities if their purpose or effect was the unreasonable restraint of trade. So although the Clayton Act was practically ineffective, its passage signaled a hopeful period for labor organizations. And so if we continue down this path, during World War I, President Woodrow Wilson formed the National War Labor Board, and that was really to prevent labor disputes from disrupting the war effort. It was formed to provide a means of settlement by mediation or conciliation of labor controversies in necessary war industries, and it adopted self-organization and collective bargaining as its basic policy. Federal regulation of labor rights continued and expanded when the federal government began to operate the railway. After World War I, though, the National War Labor Board was abolished and railroads were returned to their owners. Despite the economic sense of avoiding labor disputes through cooperation, the federal government no longer protected collective bargaining. In an effort to avoid the interruption of commerce, the Railway Labor Act, or RLA, was passed in 1926 with the support of both labor and management. It required railroad employers to negotiate with their employees, duly elected representatives, and provided for amicable adjustment of labor disputes and for voluntary submissions to arbitration. So as a result of the RLA, Congress again fostered peaceful settlement of labor disputes through negotiation and mediation. The Supreme Court case upholding that act removed major judicial obstacles by supporting the national labor policy based on an affirmative legal protection of labor organizations. In 1936, the RLA was expanded to include the fledgling airline industry, and that they listed 4 purposes. That was to avoid interruptions to commerce, protect employee right to join a union, ensure independence of carriers and employees to resolve issues between them, and settle grievances and disputes growing out of the RLA contracts. And so in 1929, the stock market crashed and the United States plunged into a major depression. The impact of the Great Depression on the workers was devastating. A third of the country's workforce was unemployed. President Hoover's program to combat unemployment served mainly to highlight the deprivation. The labor movement made more emphatic efforts to organize and demand recognition and became more politically active. The severity of conditions led to public sympathy for workers' problems. For years, the nation struggled over the right of workers to organize and to negotiate collectively with employers. We had certain acts that came out of as a result of the Great Depression, and one of these was the Norris-LaGuardia Act. Here, with respect to this, Congress had recognized the need for a national labor party. The Erdman Act that we talked about and the Clayton Act that we talked about were the first steps in ensuring industrial peace based on a balanced bargaining relationship of worker to owner. The Davis-Bacon Act, passed in 1931, was another attempt to support the fledgling union movement. This act put into place a requirement that companies use federal dollars for construction projects use the prevailing wage rate of the area as the minimum wage rate paid to their construction project. The Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932 was the next step in formulating a comprehensive national labor party. This act, like the Clayton Act, sought to restrict federal judicial intervention in labor disputes, thereby giving the unions an opportunity to grow. Courts could not enjoin strikes without actual violence, nor could they restrict the formation of the union or associated activities. The act also made illegal yellow dog contracts, and these were contracts in which the employees pledged to refrain from union membership. These protections were extended to secondary boycotts and strikes by expanding the employer-employee language of the Clayton Act. The Great Depression and the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt with strong labor support set the passage for national legislation. Roosevelt quickly proved his interest in the plight of the worker. The National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 recognized workers' rights in selecting their own representatives. Well-intentioned but poorly constructed, the National Recovery Administration had no power to enforce the act, and industry largely ignored it. And so within 2 years, the National Industrial Recovery Act was declared unconstitutional. The National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act after Senator Robert Wagner, a champion for labor, gave most private sector employees the right to organize. It required employers to meet with accredited representatives of the majority of their employees and to make an honest effort to reach settlement on issues raised. Employees now had the right to strike, and the employer's retaliatory powers were limited under the Act's unfair labor practices provisions. The National Labor Relations Board was created to enforce provisions of the Act. And so with this figure, we really just see the major provisions of the Wagner Act or the National Labor Relations Act being outlined. And so we can see that the findings and policies: denial of employers-employee collective bargaining leads to strikes, industry unrest, and obstruction of commerce. Inequality of bargaining power between employees and employers affects the flow of commerce and aggravates recurrent business depression. So, this was based on why do we need this act, and it's these 4 bullets here. Then we go into, well, so what's this act do? Well, it creates rights of employers. To organize into unions of their own choosing, to assist such labor unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. The employer unfair labor practices said, and this is what employers cannot do. They cannot interfere with employees' rights guaranteed by the Act. They cannot refuse to bargain in good faith with employee representatives. They cannot discriminate against union members or employees pursuing their rights under the Act, and they cannot engage in any attempt to dominate or interfere with employee unions. And then they go on to talk about representatives and elections, and then it goes on to talk about the National Labor Relations Board, which, as you recall, was created in order to enforce provisions of the Act. So this is a very good synopsis of this Act. So the National Labor Relations Act was followed by the passage of the Walsh-Healy Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act. The Walsh-Healy Act, passed in 1936, foreshadowed the passage of the FSLA, or Fair Labor Standards Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act was amended several times since 1938. The minimum wage has been raised several times, and we just saw the Obama administration with making attempts to raise the minimum wage again. The Fair Labor Standards Act strengthened and clarified the criteria for the exempt classification, adding both a salary level test and a duties test. To be exempt from the overtime provision, that means you get paid time and a half for hours worked over 40 hours a week. The worker must be paid a salary of $455 per week, or $23,660 per year, and meet a bona fide job duties test. Specifically, job exemptions include executive, administrative, professional, outside sales, some computer-related jobs in which the employee's primary duty includes exercising discretion and independent judgment. And so we just want to keep in mind that the Fair Labor Standards Act is what sets the 40-hour week, and it decides who is exempt from being paid overtime. And so for 12 years, the Wagner Act gave unions time and ability to grow strong. From 1935 to 1947, union membership went from 3 million to 15 million, with some industries having 80% of their employees under collective bargaining agreements. The image of organized labor in Congress was one of power. Power to stop coal production during World War II and to shut down steel mills, seaports, and automobile assembly plants after the war. That image was personified by isolated incidents of placard-carrying strikers attempting to stop scabs, which really is such a derogatory term to describe workers who cross union picket lines to perform the jobs of striking workers. Widespread strikes during 1945 and 1946 and wage drivers in 46 and 47 caused critics of the Wagner Act to increase the political pressure for amendment. The amendment's stated goal was to equalize its impact on employers. The relentless campaigning of the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers, resentment over wartime strikes, and internal union irregularities began to turn the tide against organizational labor. So In response to this, a foundation for the passage of the Taft-Hartley Amendments in 1947 was made, and this figure includes a brief chronology of the era of strong union support in the United States. Management saw the Taft-Hartley Amendments as a shift to a more balanced approach to labor relations. Labor unions were subjected to many of the same duties as employers, whereas the Wagner Act gave employees the rights to organize. The Taft-Hartley Amendments recognized their right not to organize. Under the Wagner Act, employers were required to bargain in good faith. Under the Taft-Hartley Act, that duty was extended to unions. The Unfair Labor Practices section protected employees and employers from labor unions' unfair practices. So the internal affairs of unions from the early 1800s until 1959 were not the subject of any federal law, and so legal disputes were settled inconsistently throughout the application or through the application of common law and state court interpretation of union constitution. The 1959 Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act abruptly changed that situation, and it was the first federal law passed with the objective of regulating the conduct of internal union affairs. At first, the Act covered only private sector employees, but a 1978 amendment caused it to include public employees. The 5 major provisions of the Act were member freedom of speech, member right to participate in union activities, mandatory secret ballot election of officers, and limits on the use of union funds. And so the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act of 1959, or the Landrum-Griffin Act, we said was passed in 1959. It really gave more insight and light on the internal workings of unions, which were really not, between the early 1800s and until 1959, were really not the subject of any federal law. And so at first, the Act covered only private sector employees, but in a 1978 amendment, it included public employees. And there were the major provisions of the Act were there was member freedom of speech, member right to participate in union activities, mandatory secret ballot election of officers, and limits on the use of union funds. So this Act, the Landrum-Griffin Act provisions, amending the Wagner and Taft-Hartley Acts, further eroded the power of labor unions by limiting such economic activities as boycotts and picketing. So in regulating the internal operation of labor unions, the Landrum-Griffin Act introduced controls on internal handling of union funds. It established safeguards for union elections in certain cases, gave members the right to bring suit against the union. Unions were required to have constitution and bylaws and to file these and other disclosure documents with the Secretary of Labor. It established due process rules for disciplining members. So we can see that this Act really put a lot of light on how unions work, and in a way it weakened those unions because of the membership. Now it created some accountability for its membership. The Act ensures full and active participation by the rank and file of the affairs of the union, and it accords protection of union members' rights to participate in the election process. It requires higher standards of responsibility and ethical conduct by union officials and protects members from the arbitrary and capricious whims of union leaders. And so then we move to this Employee Free Choice Act, which was first introduced in the U.S. Congress in 2007. And so even though it passed the House of Representatives in 2007, it failed to pass the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate. So during the 2008 presidential race, Senator John McCain opposed the Employee Free Choice Act. However, Barack Obama, a senator at that time, pledged his support, and that gave him a lot of union support. And so, however, and thus far, Obama has not put forth the EFCA during his administration. It is, however, though, a top legislative priority of organized labor. This act is really surprisingly short and direct and has 3 primary provisions, and that's a card check regulation. So currently employers may ask for a secret ballot election in which the union must win a majority of those voting if they want to create a union. However, under the check card recognition, certification of a union to represent a group of employees for purposes of collective bargaining can happen if a majority of the employees sign authorization cards. The second provision is first contract. If after a union is recognized to represent an appropriate unit of employees, an employer and a union are not able to reach a first contract or collective bargaining agreement within 90 days, then either side may request mediation for 30 days from the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. If that mediation is not successful, then the dispute will be referred to arbitration, and the arbitrator's decision then becomes binding on parties for 2 years. Currently, the parties must bargain in good faith. However, there's no requirement that they reach agreement, and about 1/3 to 1/2 of first contract negotiations do not settle a first contract. And then finally, there are increased penalties for law violations during a union organizing campaign or first contract negotiations that include treble payback for affected employees, civil fines up to $20,000 per violation, and the National Labor Relations Board must seek a court injunction if it has reasonable cause to determine an employer has interfered with the organizing campaign or first contract negotiation process. So now we're going to move into the topic of workforce diversity. And we can see from this illustration here, this bar chart, that the difference between union and non-union wages, right? And the difference between men, women, African American, Latino, and Asian. And so clearly, there looks to be some sort of misrepresentation, right, among the treatment of these different groups, right? And so let's talk about that a little bit more. And so we've already talked a little about the National Colored Labor Union, and we've said that while the labor unions encouraged labor rights for freed slaves, they didn't really offer them the opportunity to join the National Labor Union. And so in response to that, the National Colored Labor Union was formed. These labor leaders were seen as supportive of the civil rights movements. The program really didn't go deep into union membership. Trade unions that sponsored apprenticeship programs excluded African Americans were not alone in their discrimination. Industrial unions did not help African American workers, and so reacting to this treatment, civil rights leaders and organized organizations simply regrouped and organized this union. The Maryland Freedom Union and the Mississippi Freedom Labor Union organized and engineered strikes and demonstrations to improve the lot of African American workers who had been shunted to low-paying jobs. A boycott of a small retail chain in a white neighborhood of Baltimore, Maryland in 1966 led to the Maryland Freedom Union's first success. When AFL-CIO officials learned that the MFU had been reorganized as the exclusive bargaining agent for the employees of the retail chain, they objected. The MFU, like the activist civil rights unions, peaked in the late 1960s and then disappeared in the 1970s. Women today provide almost 2/3 of new entrants into the job market. The two major areas of potential growth for unionization are the health industry and among clerical workers. Both of these industries are made up mostly of women workers. The reluctance of unions to include women fully and women's reluctance to unionize may have had the same basis. During the post-Civil War period, women who had entered the workforce during the war continued to work. The National Labor Union found itself in the center of controversy for recognizing representatives of women's unions into its Congress, because unions did not welcome women into their organizations. Protective unions and trade associations for women were formed. Sometimes women and men working rights next to each other had separate unions. Most men workers viewed women as competition, so they decried their employment. The NLU allowed representatives of a number of women's protective unions to join their 1986 Congress, including Susan B. Anthony, the most famous suffrage. So, as we said, between 1993 and World War II, the women's labor unions forged an alliance between middle-class reformers and working-class women. These reformers and working-class women formed the Women's Trade Union League, and in 1907 adopted a 6-point platform that called for equal pay for equal work, full citizenship for women, an 8-hour workday, a minimum wage, organization of all workers into unions, and the economic programs of the American Federation of Labor. During the early 1900s, the League supported unionization of women workers in many industries, but it gave major successes, or had its major successes in the garment industry. The Great Depression greatly damaged the Women's Trade Union League, which had no convention from 1929 to 1936. Following the passage of the Wagner Act and the strong growth of the CIO, women's auxiliaries to CIO unions became a major factor in the success of the CIO organization. The famous and effective sit-down strikes of that period in the auto, steel, and mine industries were possible because of the support that wives, mothers, and sisters gave to the strikers. These women were rewarded by a promise from the CIO that women should be taught about unionism as an effective means of mobilizing support for unionism among the families of union members. Although the CIO never overtly denied admission of women into its unions, as had the AFL, neither had it ever encouraged women to organize. So as women's movements focused on improving the position of women in the United States, including women in the workforce, the goal was legislation to ensure equal treatment, equal pay, and equal rights. The success of that movement can be seen in the passage of the 1963 Equal Pay Act and Title VII to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited job discrimination on the basis of gender, among other provisions. With that law theoretically protecting women in the workforce from employers, women had the ability to turn to unionization again to increase their power in the workforce. In 1974, women within the U.S. labor movement organized the founding conference of the Coalition of Labor Union Women, CLUW, to promote a renewed interest among women to unionize. Except for American Indians and their descendants, all of the people in the United States are immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Despite this fact, the history of the American labor movement chronicles both the inclusion and exclusion of immigrants from the ranks of organized labor. Skilled laborers of whatever background were included in trade unions in the earliest days of organization. But as the Industrial Revolution converted many trade industries to industrial factories, competition with immigrant labor was keenly felt. Today, both American employers and unions recognize that new, unskilled immigrants are changing workplaces across the United States. Union leaders and managers are realizing they must abandon old assumptions of how these new workers view organized labor and instead adopt new strategies to gain the loyalty of each new wave of immigrants. And so, the workforce of the new millennium poses its own challenges and opportunities for unions, which have been historically attracted blue-collar white men, professional men and women, people of color, and those of diverse ethnic backgrounds are the workforce of today. The concerns of workers continue to be wages, working conditions, job security, and respect. It remains to be seen if unions can step in today's workplaces and represent today's workers with the same kind of successes they experienced in the past. And here we talk about the unionists that supported the Immigration Act of 1921 and 24, which restricted immigration because those acts reduced the nation's labor supply. We're just simply reiterating here that today, we recognize increasingly that because of the global nature of our workforce, because of the increasing level of diversity in the workforce, and we've begun to now be able to recognize what the benefits of that are. We're revisiting, and we expect that whether our employers or our union leaders or our managements, that we can't think about this topic in the same way that we used to, and so we have to think about it in different terms. Hopefully we shouldn't be legislated to think about it. It should happen naturally as we try to improve the workforce for the people that we know, our co-workers that work along beside us. Maybe they work as direct reports to us, maybe they're indirect reports, maybe they don't have any reporting line to us at all, but we do work alongside them day to day. And so by recognizing that and recognizing the value of diversity, we can improve that situation. This is a rather long chapter, but as far as private sector labor relations goes, it provides a lot of information about the history. And I'd ask students when they're reading the chapter to think about where we are today and to think about a lot of the illustrations that are given in the text and a lot of sort of the basic fundamental rights that are provided to workers. Because we take all of that, it seems, or a lot of that we take for granted today. And it's almost as though, we've forgotten about what it took to get us to where we are today with respect to workers' rights. And we talked about, riots, and we talked about murders, and we talked about deaths. And so, I'd ask students as they read through the chapters to kind of reflect on that a little and to recognize what it means and the sacrifice that a lot have given up to get us to where we are at this point. So please reread the text, and apologize this was such a long lecture, but it's very interesting material, I think, and we will move forward with the public sector labor relations in Chapter 3.